In our last segment, we just scratched the surface with DC Comics horror history, so we wanted to spend a little bit more time and go a little bit more in depth to the incredible legacy of horror comics that we produced. In fact, let's start with the very first horror title of DC Comics history. It's called House of Mystery. It starts appropriately enough in 1952. Let me give you a sneak preview here. You can see it's a 1950s horror comic, but one of the things that allowed it to survive was that it wasn't as dark and graphic as the comics being made by one of our competitors, EC Comics. But it continued on for over 300 issues. Here we are with the Comics Code Authority approved issue number 142, still basically dealing with horror. And then, at the very next issue, you can see there's Martian Manhunter. House of Mystery continued as a title, but then became a superhero title to house the adventures of John Jones. But it didn't stop there. Later on, it switched and became the home of Dial H for Hero with Robbie Reed and his little phone where he could become a different superhero in every adventure, and that's probably how it would have stayed. The big change that happens to House of Mystery really happens in 1968, and it starts with the hiring of Joe Orlando as editor. Now, Joe Orlando is an artist, had been working for years. He'd worked back at EC back during its glory days, producing horror comics. He also had worked recently over at Warren Publishing, which had been doing black and white magazines of horror, something that was outside the scope of the Comics Code Authority. So when Joe came over, he started making some major changes. The first thing is you can tell it's the new era right away, because right off the bat we've got back to no more Robbie Reed. We've got a horror cover right here. It's fantastic. Now, Joe Orlando hired one very important artist, and it's in this issue here, number 188. We have our very first pages by Filipino artist Tony de Zuniga. Now, Tony was fantastic. His artwork was gorgeous. But he also had another great idea, which was he told Joe that a lot of other great artists were back in the Philippines and were working for low rates and were looking for a chance to be in the American comic book business. And in 1971, DC was facing a possible labor strike of artists. And it's at this point that Tony mentions to Joe that he knows of a whole slew of amazing Filipino artists who are back in the Philippines and who would love to work at the rates that DC is paying. Well, this prompted a legendary trip. Carmine Infantino, Tony, and Joe Orlando all got on a plane and flew to the Philippines, and at the Manila National Press Club met with a who's who of contemporary and future to be well-known Filipino artists. A group that included people like Ernie Chan, Alex Nino, and two people I'd like to highlight right now, Alfredo Alcala and Nestor Redondo. Now, Alfredo Alcala is just a legendary, amazing artist back from his work in the Philippines doing things like Voltaire. He was also incredibly fast, but let me show you an image first before we talk about his speed. Here he is in House of Mystery. Take a look at the details and the line work on this here, and you say to yourself, well, that must have taken ages. Well, it's quite the opposite. Not only could Alfredo draw this well, he could also draw faster than anyone I've heard of, including Jack Kirby. When Carmine saw the art, he said, well, how many pages per week can you draw? Expecting a really low number. And he said 40. And he said, well, we're talking about penciling, inking, and lettering the pages. He says 40. And he says, okay, let me show you what I'm talking about. And he pulls out some samples of current DC artists, some really great ones as well. And he says, oh, like that? 80. Well, in either case, he was able to produce definitely the 40 pages, and there are legendary stories of him doing full 12-page or 9-page stories in just a single day. A legendary artist. Now, the other great artist that came at this time, who was already famous in the Philippines, was Nestor Redondo. I'm going to reach into a House of Secrets to give you one of my favorite panels. It's this beautiful blue drowning sequence here. He had the unenviable task of following Bernie Wrightson on Swamp Thing, and he more than held his own. And that shows you the level of talent that all of these great Filipino artists had. They inspired comic book readers, and they also inspired future generations of comic book artists, not just in the Philippines, but in the United States, but all around the world. So continue to read the comics you love. Remember DC's incredible legacy of horror titles. And let's just take a moment of pause to recognize all the great Filipino and Filipino-American artists who helped make our horror comic legacy so great.